So real quick, just wanted to share my screen and introduce again Jimmy Peng. And Jimmy, what he's presenting today is targeted for the middle school audience. And he's going through just the differences about how businesses are developed, and also really going into how to make good investment decisions. And so his next topic here is going to go over just building a business, learning the outcomes, the introduction of an income statement. And right now, I would just like to let you know that he has a lot of experience in portfolio management and macroeconomics, teaching at New York Institute of Finance. And he also is a visiting professor at NYU and teaches courses in portfolio management and applied equity research. And I'm going to turn it over to Jimmy, and he can also give a light introduction of some of his experience, because something that we do at Knife that's different is that we work with people that are real life practitioners. So they're not only coming in with real experience, they're able to connect with the students and help them learn desk-ready skills that they can apply right away. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen and let you take it, Jimmy.
Thank you, Ashley. Yes, as Ashley mentioned, I do teach young adults as well as advanced finance to the master's degree students at NYU. I think what I may not have mentioned is also I work with high net worth families, and of course, families also have young adults within the high net worth family. So I think hopefully we're all able to gauge our audience and engage our audience across all levels of their experience, age, and expertise. So I'm happy to share a little bit more with you. Chris had mentioned stocks, and stocks are actually companies, right? So every day you deal with companies, and of course, just like your homework, sort of your grades, you actually have to measure how well a company does as well, right? How do you compare how well one company does with another, and their sort of credit card or report card, if you will. Their report card would be something that you analyze and can take a look at with regard to numbers. And one of those report cards, you could say, is something called the income statement, which hopefully all of you will get to know very, very well. At some point in the future, you'll be analyzing more and more of these. We're just going to go through a very basic example. Again, this is just a very simple example of what an income statement might look like, and what are sort of the terms that you may need to understand. Every company you come across, even when you build your own company, you're going to have to make some forecasts and develop an income statement, because really, at the end of the day, you have to figure out if you're making money or not, right? If you're not making money, then that might be a problem. So let's actually begin to explore just a basic building blocks of income statements. And let me see if I can make sure I can. Okay, there we go. So, one of the things that we like to do or at least, I like to do in the classes, and I'm sure other classes will do the same, is to have students interact with each other, begin to use your own creative mind to think for yourself, and have some of these breakout sessions, if you will, to interact with your peers and to be guided by mentors or teachers just as ourselves. And for now, we're going to start with a basic, let's say, frozen yogurt stand, just to give you a taste of what an income statement might look like. So, here are some questions that you might want to ask yourself, right, before we begin. Is what would you need to even begin to develop a yogurt stand, right, a yogurt business? So I'm sure all of us have gone to the corner store to buy something, either like a yogurt or a smoothie, etc. And you're going to need some materials. And you're going to need a facility, right? Unless you're selling it out of your parents' garage. So, here's just some basic materials that you might need, from a blender machine to obviously the main ingredient being yogurt, and what are some extras, if you will, in terms of toppings or yogurt. And then, of course, you're going to need some of the basic things like spoons and cups. So to make each person come and what they might buy, right? Let me see. Show them in here. Okay. And here's some other breakout activity questions that we might entertain with regard to the group. Is, how much might you sell your yogurts for, right? So these are certainly things to think about. What your cost might be, right? So that might determine what your margin is. So that's a fancy term with respect to how much money you can make above and beyond your costs, and that would be the profitability. Some of the things that might determine how much you're going to sell that particular product for, it doesn't have to be yogurt, of course, is to look at what competitors are, right? So some of you might like Coke and some of you might like Pepsi, right? Why are they priced very similarly is because they're, there's very high competition between the two. So an example with regard to yogurt might be ice cream, right? And of course, this is just a very simple example. We're going to go to more complex examples within the class. And ultimately, what are people willing to pay? Revenues, we first start with revenues, and that's just a fancy term for something called for sales, right? And one of the measures that you could look at with regard to a company that's selling yogurt or certain products is what's the price per cup that somebody walks in and is willing to pay? What are you going to sell it at, right? It has to meet together. The price per cup and then the number of cups you sell, and that's called volume, right? So that's going to determine how much sales you can make within that particular hour, right? You could break it down by hour. You could break it down by day. And then, of course, the month and year, right? And in addition to what you might think about selling with regard to this main product, what are some extra items you might sell, right? So think about your own customer experience when you walk into a store. How does that particular business get more money from your pocket, right? Instead of just $5, are they going to charge a little bit more because you added blueberries or you added some other beverage, drinks to your order? So it's similar to a restaurant, right? When you go with your family, how much does each person spend? So there are fancier terms, of course, and the fancy term here might be average revenue per customer, right? So that's a fancy way of saying how much money does each person spend when they walk into a store, right? So when you add all those up per customer, again, that's your sales. And certainly there are other add-on items that I mentioned. Again, when you walk into it, maybe it's not as simple as the frozen yogurt stand, but it might be a restaurant, right? So you're going to order other things like fruits and salads and other items, which adds to the bill. I might mention. So I don't know if any of you guys are paying the bill. I'm certainly somebody is, or your parents are. So the more items you add, the bigger the bill, right, per person. Now, obviously, with respect to sales, there are expenses that you have to deal with and consider, right? How expensive are the items or raw ingredients that you're buying? And it might have to do with quality. You could buy the cheapest ingredient, but it's not going to taste as good. You could buy the most expensive ingredient and it tastes great. Then the question is, how much more can you charge for that product? But it tastes really good, right? So can you charge more because it tastes the best on the block? Now, with regard to cost of goods sold, that's again, going back to expenses, that's kind of the raw ingredients. And this is just with regard to this example, it's the yogurt, milk, sugar, ice, etc., cups, spoons, and straws that you need to provide that product. In addition to these expenses, of course, there are other expenses. And that's going to be if you want to hire a cashier, right? You want to hire somebody who's standing outside of your store to do some marketing, right? So some of you might have, if you're in New York, you might see people standing on the corner and holding up sort of Subway sandwich signs. And you have to pay that person, and that's called marketing costs. So some of the main costs with this term called SG&A is your labor, your rent, right? And some advertising. And certainly there's advertising with respect to these products that you see out in the street and stores. But if you're online, you're also going to see a lot of advertising, right? So when you guys go on YouTube, you're always interrupted by these ads, and that's marketing by those products. So here's just a very basic example of what an income statement looks like. You can see what I mentioned. Revenues is sales, and that's offset with the cost of each ingredient. Here, I kind of broke it down by just the very basic item. If you bought one sort of smoothie or frozen yogurt, obviously, if you add it up by the number of smoothies that you sell, that becomes your total sales. But I just sort of broke it down just so you guys can see more simply in this sort of teaser what it might look like with regard to one particular item. So you can see the basic cost there, right? You can see that it's fairly easy to understand with regard to this example. And then you have something called gross profit after your sort of raw material costs. Sales minus your cost of goods gives your gross profit. And then, of course, you have your costs, as I mentioned, of advertising, wages. I don't have rent here, so I should have rent here, and you can spread those rent costs over sort of the number of items you sell. But we'll go through these sort of obviously, more fancy terms during the actual course of what's called gross profit, operating profit. And you might also want to think about percentages, and you can go even further advanced and divide gross profit over sales, operating profit over sales, costs over sales, right? So start to think in percentages about what it takes to make your profit and your company even greater. One last thing I'll mention with regard to a summary in this particular section is a way that business folks think about their expenses. In addition to these sort of breakdowns of cost of goods sold and what's called SG&A, selling, general, and admin. That's what SG&A stands for, selling, general, and admin. Is also to think about costs regard to how it relates to the items that you're selling. So if you think about, if you're selling the yogurt, you obviously need each cup to hold that item. So the more yogurt you sell, the more cups you'll need. In other words, there's a direct relationship with regard to the yogurt and some of these costs, and the fancy term is variable costs, sort of changing. So variable means changing. As opposed to if you actually rented a store, you actually have to pay that rent no matter what. So I don't know if you guys know that because you may not have rented a store, but there's what's called a fixed cost. Doesn't matter if you sell 5 cups or 1,000 cups, you still have to pay, the $3,000 in rent per month, let's say. And that's no matter what. So these costs are fixed. If you hire a cashier, you really probably have to pay that cashier some type of fixed amount per month so they can make a living, right? So those are just some fancy terms and sort of concepts with regard to the basic income statement. That's probably as simple as it gets. And of course, we will get a bit more advanced. And the beauty of it we'll actually go through some examples, some very simple examples later on. But obviously during the modules, we'll go through some advanced and more complex examples with companies that you know and items that whether it's mobile phones or gaming consoles or Snapchat.